som grejer. Vad roligt att se så många här. Jag hade väl inte riktigt räknat med, men vi är jätteglada. Det är det faktiskt. När jag träffade Gary sist i Bryssel i april och bjöd in honom till det här, så sa han, tror att det finns folk som vill lyssna på mig? Jag ska vara i Stockholm kvällen innan, jag ska vara föredrag och nästa. Ja, så jag kommer få ihop. Och titta på många, det är jätteroligt att ni är här allihopa. Lena Stark heter jag. Jag var med och drog igång Basinkomst här i Göteborg. Det är lite mer än ett år sedan. Så satt vi 5 personer på ett fik och funderade på vad vi skulle göra. Vi hade samma idé, vi trodde på Basinkomst och ja, tänkte hur ska vi ta det här vidare och sådär. Och nu har vi hamnat här idag och nu är vi mer än 400 projekt på. Vi har startat upp grupper på 15 olika ställen i Sverige. Det händer verkligen mycket just nu och det är jätteroligt. Och det som är så roligt tycker jag att det är en blandning på alla som är här. Det är liksom en fråga som så många olika grupper kan ta till sig på olika sätt. Det tycker jag är jättespännande. Och vi har bjudit in fackföreningar. Jag vet inte, är det någon på Seko som är här? Bra. Sen har vi talked about the unions, the train strike. That guy, the from that union. So if you want to talk to him about that. Vad vi har tänkt nu ikväll är att Guy, han får presentera sig själv. Och sen får han hålla sitt anförande. Och det är ju på engelska. Och vi tänkte så här, vi pratade om det innan, så att han vet att alla kan ju engelska, men vissa ord kan vara svårt att förstå i varje fall. Det här är ju fackspråk också. Och jag tänkte bara ta upp ett ord som jag sa det till Guy förut, att jag tänker tala om vad det här ordet betyder. Så tänkte jag kommer jag aldrig använda det, men det gör jag säkert i varje fall. Och det här är ett ord som kommer upp som heter austerity. Och det betyder åtstramning. Och det är ett sådär ord som är liksom, det handlar ju väldigt mycket om varför vi har hamnat där vi har idag inom hela politiken då, att det har för mycket åtstramning. Bara så att ni vet, när ni hör något austerity, du behöver inte tänka på det, då vet ni att det är åtstramning. Och sen får ni tänka på allt runt omkring, så tror jag att det är lite svårt. Och skulle det vara så att någon vill verkligen förstå någonting som är svårt att förstå, så fråga era grannar, det funkar inte det, så räcker upp handen, så tar vi lite avbrott. Och så försöker vi förklara vad det är som han säger. Så, ja. How long are you going to speak for?
I don't know, until you fall asleep. I would say 30 to 40 minutes.
Mm. Och sen tänker vi ha en frågestund också. Så ni får komma med frågor. Och så här. Så jag representerar ju Basinkomst i Göteborg. Och det här som Guy kommer att prata om, hans lösning är just basinkomst. Så vi hoppas ju att ni som är här kommer att engagera er i det också. Och vi har lämnat in information så ni får anmäla er. Och vi kommer att hålla föreläsningar under hela hösten för olika personer. För att bilda en gräsrotsrörelse vad det gäller basinkomst. Så det känns jättespännande att alla är här. Så välkomna allihopa. Så lämnar jag ordet till
Well, first of all, thank you very much for coming out on a beautiful evening to come and listen to this talk. I have now this picture of Gothenburg that it's always sunshine. Because I've been here twice and it's both times it's been fantastic weather, so I really appreciate it. And I think we're at a fascinating moment, politically and socially, where the issues that I'm trying to address in the books have become really potent, really dramatic in a remarkably short period. And it's a very interesting phase for me as a British academic. The next year is the 800th anniversary of the greatest political documents in history in the English language, the Magna Carta. And the Magna Carta was a class-based protest and demands, set of demands, made upon the power of the state at the time. The rising class were the feudal barons, the landlords, against the authority of the king. Now, of course, Sweden had its own Charter of Liberty in 1319, and the powerful king of the day, a warrior aged 3, allowed it to be signed by the authority of the rising group in Swedish society. But it is also epical because it was a first statement of basic rights and a sense of community. And the idea of a charter and a class-based charter of demands, if you look through history, have always come up at times of great transformation of the economic and social system that's taking place. And you can trace it, and in the new book, Precariat Charter, I set myself the modest task of saying, well, if there is a precariat emerging class, what are the demands and expectations that would enable the precariat to move from being a class in the making, in a Marxian sense, to being sufficiently a class for itself in order to have the political strength to abolish the conditions that define itself. In other words, to abolish the precariat. And that would make it a truly transformative class in the Marxian sense, and would answer a lot of the critics who questioned my sexuality, sanity, humour, and every other thing since the first book was published. So I tried to define, and the charter, which at the moment only exists in English, but I have a few copies if anybody's interested by the end of the talk, and I'm very pleased to hear that it will be coming out in Swedish later this year, is an attempt to say, what are the institutional changes and the type of policies required for the precariat at this time? Now, the precariat, and there are also some copies in Swedish available if you're interested at the end, was an attempt to say, look, from the beginning of the global transformation that began in about 1980, when neoliberalism became triumphant intellectually and then politically, we have seen globalization. You all know about globalization, but there were certain characteristics which have fundamentally transformed the capabilities of our society to reproduce society. And if you remember, Margaret Thatcher, in her infinite wisdom, made the statement to a woman's magazine saying there is no such thing as society. What she meant, actually, except she got the tenses wrong, her English was not very good. What she meant to say is there should be no such thing as society. Because in this neoliberal dystopia, you're all meant to be individuals competing against each other. And if you're not competitive enough, you deserve to fail, and all the consequences are your problem. And very systematically, the individualization, the competitiveness, and the commodification of every aspect that could be commodified, including, of course, schooling and family life and so on, was fundamentally about dismantling the institutions of social solidarity, the institutions of reciprocity, and the institutions of compassion, the empathy, to the ability of all of us to put ourselves in the position of the other, you, me. The ability to say, I may not agree with you, but I think I should enable you to have the right to pursue your idea of a good life. And to do so as long as you do no harm to others and no harm to your environment, your ecology, your humanity. That sense of empathy was regarded as a dispensable non-commodity in this neoliberal model. And we've been paying the consequences ever since with this selfishness and this moralistic, judgmental state that has been emerging everywhere, and sadly in Sweden as much as in any other country I know. That is a context. But in order to understand what it is we need to do, we also need to know the basic economics. The reason I rushed in a few minutes ago is that the television had just been interviewing me, and they said 15 minutes, they took an hour. And at one point they asked me, well, you're an economist, why are you talking moralistic? And I said, well, look, you start from your economics, but that doesn't mean you end with your economics. Now, the economics are fairly simple. When you had the opening of a global transformation, in the Polanyian sense, you opened up to a global market system. And overnight, historically speaking, very quickly, you effectively quadrupled the world's labour supply. You quadrupled the number of people who were part of a global labour market. So no longer were Swedes competing against Swedes, or British against British, or even other people in Europe, but we were suddenly faced, really, not just metaphorically, with competition from 2 billion extra people, all habituated to accept living standards and wages 1/50th of what any of us in this room would have accepted as tolerable. Now, you don't have to have a PhD in economics and be like me, a wise professor of economics, to work it out that this is going to put incredible downward pressure on wages and benefits in our countries. That's the number one fact. And anybody who tells you that it is not going to put downward pressure on our wages and benefits, A, must be a stupid economist, or B, not understand any economics at all. Because that's inevitable of any market system. And at the same time, of course, the bargaining power of capital increased enormously. So the inequalities were going to rise while downward pressure was put on wages. Now, there's a recent book that's receiving hyperactive superstar treatment by Thomas Piketty, which he's taken the title of Marx and called it Capital, but then admits that he's never read Capital, which is saying that capitalism has a tendency to generate inequality. Wow, I didn't know that. And he's gone to the classic labourist, social democratic response: we need high marginal tax rates of 80% or something like that. I mean, again, because we're not going to get the return to it, because you will not have the capacity of that taking place. A global wealth tax is also a far-off dream. We need institutional changes and political changes that are far more realistic and gritty to face this inequality. And the inequality is being generated by something very different, which is the biggest contextual point for the discussion of basic income. The 20th century was the only century in history, I don't know how many economists are here, but I'm sure if there are some that you will understand this better than I, which is the only century when the total income was essentially divided between profits and wages. So the profit share went up, wage share went down, or vice versa. There was a constant struggle mediated by the state on the shares going to those two interest groups. Suited the Swedish model because you could have collective bargaining and you could have a Swedish centralized system where you could come to consensus divisions. But we know that in the globalization era, capital won that battle. It was bound to win that battle for the reasons I've just described, and technological innovations have helped it win that battle. But what is the new kid on the block is that an increasing proportion of total income goes to rent. Rental income, which is unearned through productive activities. It goes to the owners of patents. It goes to the owners of intellectual property. It goes to those who can monopolize positions of power. And it goes to people who can dominate natural resources and technology. And in that context, an incredible amount of total income is going to rentiers who don't do any sort of productive activity themselves, but make money out of making money. And it's the enormity of that transformation which is meaning that in the 21st century we need a new system of distribution, a new basis, a new logic of understanding how we distribute income that is produced by the productive system. So that is a contextual point that I want to begin with and leave it just for your reflection. We have several points so far. We have a sense of loss of empathy, of individualism, competitiveness. And alongside that is a grotesque development of chronic insecurity. It dates me that when I first was writing about globalization and the flexible labor systems developing in the 1980s, it may not have passed your notice, but I wrote a little book on the Swedish labor market and was saying essentially that the Swedish model could not go forward. It had reached fantastic achievements, it made fantastic achievements, but the growth of more flexible labor markets, just like anywhere else, was going to produce more and more insecurity and more inequality. Now, of course, we take this for granted. But I remember at the time arguing with friends in the LO and the PTO and various others, academics, who said, no, the Swedish model is fine. It's fine. You don't meet so many of those today, but I'm sure there are a lot of them who are saying it's fine, everything's fine. But I don't think it is. And I think it's the same problems that we're facing everywhere. Now, the global transformation has generated a new global class structure. And that was the essence of the first book on the Precariat. And I think I'll just briefly mention it without going into the details, with apologies, A, to those who've heard me before for repeating things, and B, to others for not going into sufficient detail to be clear. I just hope that I steer the middle course in doing so. But our class fragmentation is very, very crucial to the political possibilities in the next few years. We have a plutocracy, an elite that's out there in the stratosphere with their billions and billions and their criminality and so on. The ultimate rentiers, they only have to cough and they will make an extra $1 billion. You know, they say some shares are going up, and because we all think, he knows, their shares go up and he then sells them and he makes the 100 million. You know, that sort of character. There are plenty around. They number about 500, I expect, in the total world, but they have enormous power. Below them, a long way below them, is the salariat. In a sense, that was part of the white-collar union strategy, providing people with long-term employment security, access to pensions, access to long holidays, paid holidays, all the trappings, going on wonderful bonding trips to golf clubs and drinking, stewing coffee. You know, a lifestyle of comfort and security. But their numbers are shrinking, and they are actually getting very worried because a lot
proletariat, and alongside are the consultants and the professions rushing around, making a lot of money, becoming politically smug and self-satisfied and slightly ridiculous. We'll leave them. A long way below that is the old proletariat, shrinking, disappearing. That was the welfare state. The Swedish model was initially built for that from 1938 onwards. But they're shrinking and they no longer have the political or collective power or sense of unity to forge the future. So they're losing. And it's the precariat underneath that where I find the basic income debate has a resonance which is becoming very hot. What is the precariat? Very briefly, you can define it in three senses. First, it has distinctive relations of production. The precariat consists of people who are expected to habituate themselves to a life of unstable labour, insecure labour, without any sense of occupational identity or narrative that they can give to their lives. They have to do a hell of a lot of work for labour that doesn't get counted as labour and doesn't get compensated for as labour. And they have a peculiar characteristic, which is that this is the first emerging class in history where they are expected to have a level of education higher than the level of labour than they expected to perform. That's very strange. And it creates an existential insecurity and stress that is actually pretty bad and difficult to deal with if you're at the receiving end. And that is the norm inside the precariat. But besides this, it has a loss of control of time. You have a precariatized mind. Because if you're in the precariat, you are facing chronic uncertainty and you don't know which is the best set of actions to take at any time. So you're flitting between activities, and as a result, you feel out of control and under stress and constantly worrying about it. A sense of anxiety. But that sense of anxiety is being used to control people. Because if you're chronically anxious, then you're fearful. You're fearful. And if you're fearful, you obey commands even before they're given. Because that is your situation. And that, of course, is hardly what you would hope in a good society. But that is what millions of people are experiencing as we sit here. That's how bad it is. The second thing is that the precariat has distinctive relations of distribution. What this means is that unlike all other classes, before and now, it has to rely almost entirely on money wages for its income. It doesn't get those fancy non-wage payments. It doesn't get secure rights-based access to state benefits. It doesn't get the community support that previous generations could rely on from their communities and families and friends and relatives. It doesn't have any of those things, so it has a real fragility. There's a literature out there about resilience and the capacity of people to deal with uncertainty, unknown unknowns. But people in the precariat don't have any capacity to have resilience because they are not provided with rights, which is the last part of the distinguishing feature of the precariat. Because this is the first class in history where millions of people are losing rights. They are losing civil rights, the classic things of the Magna Carta, that you must have every right mean that you can only be denied those rights by due process, by a legal process in which you're judged by your peers and you cannot be sanctioned or lose anything unless there is a legal process that is fair and equal to everyone.
So they're losing civil rights. I can give you countless examples. This book does so. They're also losing cultural rights. The ability to exist in a community of your own choosing, in a way of your own choosing. That sense of cultural rights which was also most fundamentally about occupational communities. The old occupational guilds. I belonged to a community that gave me my rights within a community, within a wider sense of community of citizenship. And you're losing political rights, being denied the vote in many cases, or being denied the capacity to make a choice of options that are appealing to me. That is your political right. If you do not have that opportunity, then you have lost your political rights, really. And they're losing social rights because more and more we have seen the state converting social insurance, universal benefits, into means testing benefits and deciding, are you poor enough? Are you deserving poor, or you've done something to deserve to be poor? And if so, you'll get no benefits. And I decide because I'm a powerful little bureaucrat. And you shut up. Oh, did you say something? Out. Don't come back for another 6 months. There are millions of people experiencing that sort of treatment. Don't kid yourself, because I'm sure many of you have anecdotes of how many people, your friends, your neighbours, have experienced that. I cannot tell you, since these books were published, I get thousands of emails. People wanting to tell me how they've been treated. Or we have Anglo-Saxon words for them. Because that is not the way to make a good society. It is part of the neoliberal, utopian, utilitarian treatment. As long as we serve our middle-class interests, these minorities can be treated in any way we like, because they haven't got the effective power to do anything about it. Now, all of these things are producing this precariat, but at the moment it is a class in the making because it's still at war with itself. There are three varieties in the precariat. The first variety are people falling out of all working class communities and families. Their parents had occupations of some pride, and they're falling into the precariat, and they have lost their past. So they have a sense of relative deprivation because they can't even have the past of their parents and those communities. Now, these people tend to be relatively uneducated, and therefore they listen to populists, neo-fascists, dare I say it, a certain party in this country, which we all know. They play the nationalist card, they play the subtle racist card, and the anti-migrant card, and they use very clever little languages which just border on acceptability. We're seeing that in every country, playing on the fears of that part of the precariat and turning that fear into an agenda of hate against the second part of the precariat, which consists of the real denizens, the denizens who have no real rights, the migrants, the Roma, the ethnic minorities, the religious minority, whatever it is that you can target today, you know. And we're seeing that getting worse and worse, and we're seeing it in these new elections this year. When I first wrote about it, I didn't think it was going to be quite as quick as it has been, but that I'll come back to at the end if I still have time, which is that this hate of this second part. Now, this second part has a sense of relative deprivation because they have no sense of home. They have a relative deprivation because they have no present. The first one had no past, the second one has no present. And here we have a very worrying set of features that I was discussing with a couple of MPs this morning, Swedish MPs, because one side of them is turning inwards. Keep their heads down, become politically detached, just survive, just survive. And every now and then it gets too much and we have days of rage like in Stockholm last year, in other places. And the other part is saying, actually our home is over there. And we must go and fight the jihad, or whatever it might be. Because at least that gives us a sense of status, of pseudo-masculinity, or whatever it might be. That sort of reaction, you have to be very careful how you treat it, how you speak about it, and no doubt I've used wrong words somewhere in the speech. But it is something that we must understand, because unless we understand it, we can't address the crisis in the second part of the precariat. So they're victims and they become villains, a few of them, tiny number, but then you get collective punishment against the whole lot, which is what's been happening all over the world. And then you've got the third part of the precariat. The third part of the precariat are those who have an education. They went to university and they went to college or whatever, and they were sold a lottery ticket. And they came out with their lottery ticket, which was to promise them a career and a future. And they find they have no future. They come out and they find they were sold a false lottery ticket, which cost more and more of those people are suffering from status frustration because they have no sense of future. And they are denied a sense of future by our politicians. Because our political class has been commodified, catering to a middle class set of interests, and the plutocrats who fund their parties, or whatever it is, and the media who are owned by the plutocrats, and therefore are not offering a sense of future. They are not offering a sense of future with universal rights, with reduction of inequalities, and dealing with this crisis of declining wages. They are offering a language of commodified politics, an old style. But we have news for them. The precariat's not listening. The precariat's saying Anglo-Saxon words to them. The precariat is saying what one beautiful piece of graffiti had it in Spain. My dreams are not in your ballot box. My dreams are not in your ballot box. Their apathy, so-called, is not apathy. It is a statement that your politics are dead. Your politics are what Beppe Grillo memorably said, dead men walking. And we are in a fascinating phase because more and more people on the left of centre and the right of centre, the intelligent professional politicians, are realising that they have no clothes. I mean, who would have said 20 years ago that the Social Democrats in Sweden, the nirvana of social democracy in Sweden, would get 25% of the Swedish vote in an election? I mean, that's dramatic. But the same with the moderates. They have no clothes either, so I don't want to make a political statement. It's clear that the political establishments everywhere are losing their clothes. And the sooner they lose their clothes to so much embarrassment, the better. Because we need a new politics of paradise based on the emerging class and what their needs and what their aspirations are. And that's where the book, the first book, reached. And the second book says that for every transformation, there are three principles. The first principle is that it will only come about on the basis of leadership by the emerging mass class. 100 years ago, it was the proletariat. 200 years ago, it was the bourgeoisie. At the time of Magna Carta, it was the growing barons, the landlords, the aristocrats. Different stages in history you can see different emerging classes. Today it is the precariat. And unless the aspirations and needs of the precariat are addressed and the politicians wake up, that it's this class that really needs to be brought into the mainstream, we will not get a forward march. The second thing is that every new forward march requires new forms of collective action. And I want to make the point very fundamentally before briefly talking about the subject where you've come to listen this evening, but I'm trying to give this context because the context is everything, is that two fundamental needs are out there. The first need is basic security, basic income security, and I'll come to that in a second. But the equal second need, or equal first need, is strong collective voice. We will always remain vulnerable unless we have strong collective voice. And we need strong collective voices for every interest that needs to be represented in the state. Whether you're women, whether you're a child, whether you're a migrant, whether you're a disabled person, any particular group, their voice needs to be heard. And at the moment, we don't have a state able to do that, but new forms of collective action are beginning. It won't be old-style trade unions with their labourist past. I always joke that, if I want to make you all rush for the bar, I'll start talking about trade unions. Because the Precariat says, okay? And the third thing is that every new forward march, every transformation, every great step forward towards defining the great trinity, égalité, fraternité, liberté, has three struggles. Three vital struggles. The first struggle is a struggle for recognition. Now here I think we've won already. 2 or 3 years ago, if you started talking about the Precariat, then there were a lot of people, yeah, it's me, I'm useless, I fail. But in the last 2 years, as a result of the Occupy movement, the Indignado, the Arab Spring, all these protests, and there's been more protests in this period than any comparable period in history, and a good study has shown this. And we've got a sense of recognition. So millions of people now, whether they use the word or something similar, can look in the mirror in the morning, if they have a mirror, and can say, I'm not a failure. I'm part of an emerging class of people who are victimized by the structures and the processes that are taking place around me. And I don't feel sorry for myself, I feel some pride, because it is a common human predicament that millions are facing. And that, I think, is why more people are moving from the primitive rebels phase of protest, I'm against everything, to now looking for a new politics. And why suddenly basic income is becoming a subject that is being legitimized because it fits into this agenda. But before I come to that, after recognition, there is a struggle for representation. And we have to participate in that, which means that the voice of the Precariat has to be in every institution of the state. Your interests, the interests of the insecure has to be there, particularly in social agencies. But this third struggle is a struggle for redistribution. It is not the same struggle as the beginning of the 20th century. It is a struggle for the redistribution of the resources and assets that we need and the Precariat need to reproduce itself and reproduce its conditions for reproduction and to be able to participate as an equal in a good society and develop our capabilities. Now, the inequalities in these respects are much greater than the inequalities in income. The insecurity of the people in the Precariat is vast, whereas the security of all these people in these upper groups is vast. So the inequality of security is actually much greater than the inequality measured in income. The same with time. If you're in the salariat or in the elite, you can buy expertise, you have time, you can go to your wonderful places and you can relax and you can read and do whatever you wish. If you're down in the Precariat, you have no control
control of your time. You have to do what everybody says. You're worried, you're endless, you've got this little baby, you've got this sort of problem facing you, and you've got to, well, I've got no time, I've got to retrain, I've got to go to this course, I've got to go to that. You have no sense of control of time. So the inequality of time is precious, a precious asset. And we need a politics of time. The third is something which is very, very important for the precariat, which is space. Quality space. The inequality in access to quality space is actually vast and vastly increased under this neoliberal model because of the privatization of land, the privatization of museums and facilities, the corroding of parks, and this fantastic protest in Gezi Park in Istanbul, which has been followed by these wonderful protests of the precariat across Brazil, which we're seeing now right in our faces with the World Cup. It's about the encroachment on public space, encroachment on the commons, which has both got an ecological, a green issue, and a social issue because you reproduce yourself in the public space. If imagine all the parks of Gothenburg were privatized, and all the facilities were privatized and made the subject of commercialization. Well, that is actually what has been happening around the world, step by step by step. And there's a chapter in here on the role of the allotment, which I know is a Swedish thing as well as a British thing, but it's also an international phenomenon. You think of the allotment as a metaphor. You need it to give yourself work that is not labour. You need just to revive your sense of humanity because of your interaction with nature. And reproducing slow food and slow time and interacting politically with your neighbours. It is symbolic of an appreciation of an attachment to nature. And it teaches you to value nature in the most green sense. So you say, look, I can interact with nature. I can see the birds, I can see whatever it is, and I must do everything possible to preserve it. The very interaction with le terroir, as the French call it, provides you with an anchor that fights for a commons and a recovery of the environment. But we're also facing the inequality of education. It's far more unequal than people presume. Because although we've had mass schooling and mass education, there's been a commodification and a commercialization of the education for the precariat. You get rote teaching, you don't learn about your culture, your history, your philosophy, so you can come out uneducated. But I'm prepared for a job. I've got this diploma. But you actually haven't had an education. Whereas if you're in the elite in the salariat, you go to your Harvard or Stockholm or Oxbridge or wherever, the elite places, and you still get your liberating, culturally enriching. Not as much as it should be, but it's still relatively so. And we've got this commodification of education which is very corrosive politically. Because unless you're exposed to the great tragedies, the great artists, the great cultural traditions of your society, you don't actually learn to understand why empathy is so important. Why cultural diversity is so important. And why you need to have people's different views. You know, I don't like their views, but to understand why that should be accepted. So we need a strategy for redistributing that. Now, our charter tries to address all these issues. And basic income, I've deliberately, several of my friends in the basic income movement said, Guy, why have you done that? I put it number 25 in the 29 articles in my proposed charter. And the reason I did it is, look, we must understand that a new progressive action must require a package, a consolidated approach, which starts from values
starts from what is the crisis we're facing and puts together an agenda. I do not believe basic income is a panacea. I believe basic income is an essential component of a new progressive strategy. And I'll briefly allude to that in my last few remarks. A basic income should first and foremost be demanded, be struggled for as a matter of social justice, not as a matter of anti-poverty. It is a measure of anti-poverty. It is important to accept that that is a necessary aspect of it. But fundamentally, I think it's far more important to use the idea of a basic income as a reassertion of universal rights. What Hannah Arendt called the right to have rights. It is really potentially emancipatory, and a right is a freedom-enhancing thing. And in that process, I've always found it really useful to draw on Thomas Paine and his agrarian justice, where he sort of articulated it in a slightly different way from what I do, but is essentially the same. Which is to say, look, we as a society should have the intelligence to recognize that your wealth and my wealth and your wealth is far more due to the contributions and the efforts of our forebears, going back hundreds of years, and their struggles and their contributions and their daily labours and their early deaths. Far more to do with that than anything you and I do. And only an idiot would think otherwise. And in that context, you don't know